Today we're having a book event. It's not quite a book launch because the book is out and has been out. It's a book event to go deeper into the book. The book is the Racism Handbook for people classified as black, a guide to how racism really works. And we have today Howard Dean Johnson, the writer, the author of the book, and he will introduce himself, his own background, and the background to the book as he starts speaking when I finish. But he will introduce the contents of the book and the history and development of race issues and racist ideas within society, going back, I don't know how far yet. At the end of the talk, there'll be a Q&A, and he'll help us to understand that development. He'll help us to understand racism and capitalism. He'll help us to understand racism as control through pseudoscience like eugenics and Eurocentrism. Its role in racial inequality and racial injustice. We'll also include issues about colorism, anti-African, and blackness in our own communities today. We'll also explore, hopefully in our conversations, antiracism and black studies, especially in our search for solutions. Please welcome Howard Dean Johnson.
Thank you. I'm so very grateful for you coming out. It's difficult coming out to events since the lockdown, isn't it, really? Because we've now become familiar with Zoom and so on, so it's hard to come out, and certainly on a Friday after work. I'm very grateful because I was at work today as well, and that feeling of, oh, I'm so tired. So very grateful for you to come out today. It shows commitment to our struggle. I've been around for a while, but people don't know me. Just like there's people around now, cogitating in the background, we don't know what they're like, but they were there. See, I've been around quite a while, but I was sort of learning and studying and committed to the liberation of black people, fully. When we do Q&A, you can ask me questions about that. Let me just tell you a little bit about my background. I'm a school teacher. I teach English for a living. It's not the totality of where I want to be, but it's something to do to earn a living. But I think that what's important to me is about the liberation of black people. That's my central idea. And that's why I wrote this book, really, so that we can really understand our situation that we're in as black people. Because when not to use a word that is bandied about a lot, when I woke up, so to speak, it became clear to me that black people are what I call in my book, and I don't mean this disparagingly, racially illiterate. That's the term I use in my book. It doesn't mean we're stupid or anything like that. It just means when it comes to matters of race, we're actually very, very backward. We're illiterate racially. And that's the reason why I've written the Racism Handbooks, that can help and address that issue. And at the end, you can ask me more questions about myself. But yes, I'm a teacher and I've been studying race and racism for over 30 years. And when I decided to write the Racism Handbook, because essentially it's a black studies guide, I had to focus in and start studying other things, because as we'll get into it in the slideshow, black studies has multiple disciplines. It's different from black history. So it meant that I had to really get my study head down and study more than just race and racism. So my focus today will be really about the book, because I wrote the book for the black community. Back in 2015, I wrote an article and I took it to a university. There was a possibility of extending that into perhaps a PhD program, but it was quite clear that it was going to go in a direction that I didn't want. And when I reflect on that, really, I think I wasn't going to do it anyway, because I just needed to write this the way I perceive black people need it. You see, I didn't want any interference from a lecturer or an associate professor telling me something that he or she hasn't experienced or hasn't studied. So I didn't want that influence. So that's a little bit about me. I studied music many years ago, and then in the mid that was my undergraduate studies, and then in the mid 2000s I studied whiteness at the UCL. Whiteness is a study of white privilege and how it impacts the lives of black people. So you're studying colonialism and slavery and so on, but through the lens of whiteness. That's what that is. You're not studying their food and so on. So that's a little bit about me, but as I say, in the Q&A you can ask me a little bit more if you want to. There's nothing special about me, I'm just an ordinary person. So the racism...
Before we start,
yeah.
what I'm going to do now is turn down the lights so that we could see the presentation as well. So how do we talk in darkness to you? And there will be people coming in late, I don't doubt. Yeah. So just to show them where the seats are in the darkness. Okay?
Right, so the Racism Handbook for people classified as black. Okay, a guide to how racism really works. So what do I mean? Oh, I can't see the buttons here. Okay, I'm only joking. Only joking. Right, I'm going to read you an excerpt, but it's on the screen, which is great, because I wouldn't be able to see it. So here we are. This is an excerpt from the book. This is the opening from the introduction. If you do not understand racism correctly, you do not understand yourself. The black self is constructed in the Eurocentric world in which you were born. This handbook will show that in the Western world, you were born into a global, interconnected system of racism, white domination or supremacy. This is so whether you live in the UK, US, France, Germany, Africa, the Caribbean, or anywhere else on Earth. Moreover, it means you were categorized at birth as a sub-person. Furthermore, it means that your psyche has been subjected to unrelenting psychopolitical violence from a very early age. Fundamentally, this violence has disconnected you from your history and your black self. Thus, the purpose of this handbook is to help black people fully grasp the full meaning of this system so as to understand the social, political, economic, cultural and psychological nature of their existence as African people classified as black. So that's just an opening there of the introduction of the book. So why is the Racism Handbook needed at this time? Now, I set this presentation up in, I think it was late 22, but because of the reproduction of racism, much of the data is the same. So today, we know now, with the re-election of Donald Trump, that discrimination certainly is rising in the US, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But certainly in the UK, we look at the US landscape, we can see about 6 in 10 Americans say race relations in the UK are bad. About 56% are convinced that the president has made race relations worse, and just 15% say it has improved race relations. Now this was related to his first presidency, and recently, as we know, it was easy to predict that he was going to be president. So we know that racism is back. It's not like it's gone, but it's there under the surface, and now we have tendencies that are fascist, that help to incubate, let's say incubate racism. In Europe, I don't know if you saw this report, the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights Commission paper, Being Black in the EU, reported continued racism widespread across Europe. This is the reality for many black people in the EU. Just because of the colour of their skin, which is race, people of African descent are routinely met with unfair treatment and bias when seeking jobs or homes. Racial discrimination, harassment, violence continues to haunt their daily lives. Okay? So yeah, it's absolutely on the rise. In Britain, there's a huge amount of segregation. Even though it's not signposted, okay, but it's or reinforced by laws, it's there. Therefore, it will be difficult for most whites to even acknowledge racial injustice as a reality or a problem. Mills explained, this is an Afro-Caribbean scholar, he's passed now, and he lived in the United States. He explained that historically a lot of whites tend to measure how they are doing in life in relation to black people. He called that intrinsically relational. If they are higher than blacks on the social ladder, it is this that seems important to them. It seems impossible to get some whites to reject this perception. So that's just a little taster, and we're well aware of it as black people, that racism is vamping up around us. So, introduction to the Racism Handbook. That's why I've written this book, to educate ourselves on the finer details of race and racism. I was saying to someone earlier, and we'll do it in Q&A anyway, about this concept of racial illiteracy. It's massive among our people, and it's something that we have to address. So what do I mean by the title? Well, in terms of our history and early global migration and human anthropology, black and African people, of course, we have a global presence. So, thus a global presence cannot be explained by the term, which came out in the mid-2000s, Afrophobia, because we have to account for the genocide of other non-white people, such as the Tasmanians and other oppressed black peoples around the globe, who are not in the modern sense African people, but anthropologically they were. Thus the term classified as black is a racial category. It applies to all people whom the elite whites, Europeans, have racialized as black, inferior, and viewed as, Mills calls the term, sub-person. So classified as black, black is a racialized term. The subtitle, A Guide to How Racism Really Works, is an inference, it refers to European epistemology. All epistemology means is knowledge production. Where did it come from? Where did we get knowledge? Is it true? Where did it come from? How did we discover knowledge? Who's dispensating the knowledge? That's what we call the epistemology. And when I say the guide to how it really works, a kind of easy way of saying, where did the knowledge come from? Are we sure about the knowledge that we have? So what is the purpose of the Racism Handbook? Well, the Racism Handbook is a framework for black and African liberation from racial oppression, as was said, and an aid to black studies, a combined anti-racism and black studies book. Now, I could have called it Introduction to Black Studies, but I felt that that would be a little bit limiting, in that it would make some black people think that it's very, very academic and push it to the side. But on the other hand, if you have a book with the word racism on the front, then it would open the doors more. More black people would relate to it. And of course, racism really is a metonym for colonialism, slavery, neo-colonialism, the world capitalist system, the global north. It's all racism. So racism is a catch-all term, and I decided to use that rather than just calling it Black Studies. I don't know if anybody knows of Malana Karenga's book, Introduction to Black Studies. I'm not comparing it to that book, but the Racism Handbook is an attempt to present black people, different and simplified outline of that book. It's deeply academic, it's a massive book, but it can be alienating for a lot of black people. I'm a teacher and I'm very aware of that. So that's the book I was talking about there. Probably stocked in this shop. And there's the Racism Handbook. I'm trying to simplify black studies. Right, so black studies, what is black studies? Black studies is not the same as black history. Black history is a part of it. Black studies adopts an interdisciplinary approach, so it doesn't limit itself to the historical perspective. So if you study black history, we study ancient history and ancient medieval history, that's a part of black studies, okay? But black studies will include lots of disciplines, and I'll tell you why. So for example, it would include sociology, literature, political science, economics, race, class, gender, and so on, all right? And then we put those together, and in aggregate, we can call that black studies. It's around between 10 to 12 disciplines, all right? Black studies focuses on the present and the future. It emphasizes it examines current issues. So we're not just looking at Kemet or the temples or Ma'at, sacred science and so on. It's looking at current issues that affect the black community. The emphasis also is on activism by advocating for social justice and racial equality. Really important at the moment because obviously there's been attack on the whole anti-racist and social justice movement that developed towards the middle of the 20th century, and they're attacking that. They started with critical race theory and so on. Black Studies also has a global perspective. It studies the experiences of black people around the diaspora. So in that sense, it's a more interdisciplinary study. Okay, it includes multiple disciplines. Okay, so in my book, this is the Racism Handbook, Volume 1, and Volume 2 will be much of the same, but other disciplines. Okay. So, in this volume, what have we got? Introduction, which is a sort of overview of the reality of racism. And that, for many of us, just looking at the age group here, that's quite obvious to us. Racism's real. But having spent over 20 years in schools, I can tell you that our children are racially illiterate, and much of them have no concept of the reality of racism. They don't know what it was. In fact, this week in school, a student said to another student, did you put some alcohol in that water, because she was drinking it and she was coughing, and the other student said, you're being racist towards me. I couldn't believe it. You know, they think that hate is just racism. So our children are illiterate. Okay, that's absolutely going on there. Right, so that introduction of racism, just an overview that we must take racism as real, and we have to view it as something that's very significant in our lives. Then it's followed by 3 chapters. What is race? What is racism? And Charles Darwin on race. Now these 3 really need to be read together, as well as the introduction. When I did my qualitative research, and that just means you have interviews with black people and Asians and whites and so on, and you ask them, what do you think racism is? What do you think race is? Black people can give a kind of general understanding of racism, but race, no. It's quite fragmented. So this chapter 1 is about race. A lot of black people merge them together, or race is just an identity, and then there's racism. I found that a lot in my studies. So you ask, what is race? Some black people just thought race is racism, which is correct. But beyond that, they didn't have much to say, or they merged race with racism, or they thought that race was just an identity. There's an ethnic group, that's race, and then there's racism. No. It's much, much deeper than that. And that chapter deconstructs the whole idea of where race came from. Then, of course, racism. Okay, so it will explain that the principal core and unit of racism is race. So you have the first chapter, what is race? Trust me, black people do not fully understand race. So that chapter is absolutely important. Then it's followed by race, and then followed by a chapter called Charles Darwin on Race. Now, in schools, what you have is Charles Darwin being mentioned in terms of biological development and so on. They keep it related to the natural world. But Charles Darwin was a racist, and the title of his book is The Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of the Favoured Races in Their Struggle for Life. And when you go, the publishers for the last, 100 years, just call the book, when they keep reprinting the book, they just call it The Origin of the Species. They take the other title out, or The Preservation of the Favoured Races. So it's a race book. And certainly in the second book, he has a whole chapter on race. So Charles Darwin is central to racism. And a lot of black people don't know that. Very, very important. Charles Darwin is central. He is part of the construction of race. Charles Darwin, Immanuel Kant, which is the West's greatest philosopher, along with Carlos Linnaeus. Those three are the key players in the construction of race. Racism, as I said, chapter 2, and then Charles Darwin on race. Really important to read those three together. Then we have the slave trade. Now, there's incredible books on the slave trade, but my chapter is called a corrective. So what it does, it just corrects all the misinformation around the slave trade, starting with the term. When you're a teacher, sometimes you have to teach other subjects as well, and it's awful how the books are presented. It's just really, really bad. Layers and layers of misinformation. It's incredible. So this chapter is a corrective. It just looks at all the major fault lines in how we understand the so-called slave trade. That's what that's about. And then through that process, you can study more books. Then, of course, the perennial debate that we have as black people, reparations. Will we ever receive it? And that is a question, because it's hard to determine whether we will receive it, but it's deeply linked to racism. And when this world fully understands that black people have the right, full justice to reparations, then we might go some way into suppressing racism on this planet. But until the world realises that we should get reparations, we're always going to be on the back foot, all right? But that's an overall basics discussion on reparations. Very important. And I'm going to talk about how I've written the book later, the style of it as well. It's very simplified, my book, very simplified. Then we have Racism in Christianity. Now, this is not a book that goes into the Bible and says, oh, look, there's racism. It doesn't do that. All it does is historicises Christianity. It's not a chapter to determine whether the Bible's right. It doesn't do any of that. All it does is say, let's have a look at what historically happened and how Christianity was involved in that. And that's what that's about, really. Christianity, because of course, black people were involved at the inception of Christianity. And that's often not in their books. It's not in European books, but we know it to be true. We've got the evidence for that. So we were at the forefront of the establishment of Christianity. Okay, we were involved, Arabs were involved, and Europeans were involved. It's not just the story that's put out, that it's just a Middle Eastern story. Much more to it than that. So that's a historical breakdown of racism in the world and Christianity as part of that. It's not a diatribe against certain verses in the Bible. It doesn't do any of that. Then, of course, African composite religion. That needed to come second because a lot of black people think that our religion is either Islam, Christianity, or Judaism, or Buddhism, or whatever. As if we don't have a religion. We do have a religion, but basically it formed all other religions, you see. And plus, the religion of black people is part of the system of racism. We were colonized and so on, so that's all part of it. Okay, so that basically gives you a breakdown of spirituality, African spirituality, and African religion. Then, very important issue, the racialization of mixed black and white race people. Very important issue because obviously black people have been domiciled in white societies for hundreds of years, and of course there is this concept called mixed race, and there are hundreds, thousands of mixed race people in this country, United States, around the world, and it's really good to understand what that's about. There's a lot of confusion about that, so that my chapter sorts that out, explains what this racialization, what is a mixed race person. There's lots of stuff on it, and unfortunately even people, so-called mixed race people, write about it as if with no full understanding. You can't understand mixed race until you understand race. Okay, so that's the chapter there that it was necessary for me to write. Then this may, I don't go out of my way to upset black people because we are people of trauma, but things have to be said. This chapter is called Self-Help Books. Got to put the glasses on because it's dark. It's not that, it's because I can't see. Self-help books, snake oil, anti-black development. Now, back in the 80s, I would say I had perhaps 30 self-help books because I thought that was the natural thing to do. You go to a bookshop, not this bookshop of course, and 20 ways to build your character and so on, or 12 spiritual ways of getting this, that and the other. And after reading these books and studying race, I found that most of these books were toxic for black people. And I'll say it again, not all of them, but many self-help books are toxic for black people. And I'll just give you a little taster. Obviously, your psyche is based on your past and your history. No one in this room has the psyche of, say, someone from Polynesia. They have a different history that affects their psychology. You see, so why are we assuming that we can go into a bookshop and pull self-help off about the mind? Whose mind? You see, so we have to focus in on our mind. A lot of these self-help books are about the mind, which is, of course, Eurocentric. Okay, so that's an important chapter there. The reason I put that in this book is because a lot of black people think that they're going to liberate themselves through self-help books. Absolute mistake, not going to happen. And then finally, conclusion. Quite easy to write this chapter really because we know we have huge amounts of information on how to liberate ourselves. It's just our trauma, what we've been through. It's not the fact that we have different ideologies. I used to think it's that because we have all these different ideas. Not really that. It's the way we interact with ourselves and our relationship to racial domination. So that was it's clear what we need to do to liberate ourselves. It's just the will and the ability and the emotional strength to be able to do it. So that's the content. Some of the features in that introduction there. I'm going to speed up a little bit. White myth and racial ignorance, understanding the term white supremacy, the problem of racial education, Okay, and there's a quote there from Marcus Garvey: having had the wrong education at the start of his racial career, black people become their worst enemy. So I said a little bit about the chapter race, didn't I? It outlines the historical development and the idea of the concept of race and its creation. It shows that essentially the modern concept of race is racism. We do not understand racism without studying race. You cannot. And I have a video on my YouTube channel which explains the development of race into racism. You don't just have racism. You have race first as a project of colonial domination, not race as an enduring identity. Race needs to be understood in two ways: my race, your race, or any other race, and then race as a colonial project. And it shows the sole purpose of, this is the chapter on racism, the sole purpose of racism is to maintain race. Race not as an enduring identity, we don't necessarily see that in negative terms, but race as a project of domination. It explains that racism is not just individual prejudice, not simply an ideology, a belief, a set of motivational attitudes, a moral evil, a necessary part of human thinking. These are all incorrect notions. This chapter shows that racism is a global, interconnected system or systems of racism. There are other terms that explain that: structural racism, systemic racism, lots of terms in the world that can help us to do that. I did speak a little bit about Darwin, so I'm really glad that we don't need to read all this. But Darwin is central to racism today. You would not have racism today without Darwin. And that is I suppose might be a bit of a new information for many black people. You need to read the chapter and it'll break it down for you, because he was there at the inception of race. You do not have racism without race. And he was there, developing it. As I said, the slave trade, my chapter gives an overview of the enslavement of African people that now plays a key role in instructing the very meaning of citizenship for black people. It discusses the various details and aspects of the so-called slave trade. Okay, and as I said earlier, it corrects all the problems there. Reparations, I mentioned that earlier, didn't I? General overview of reparations. Really important that black people understand that. It's really, I can't underscore that enough, that we need to understand how that works. Then, as I said earlier, this is a very sensitive area of study for many black people who are naturally spiritual and religious people. It explains the complicity of white Christianity culture as a significant aspect of racial ideology. So it's not an attack on the Bible, so to speak. It is, how was Christianity involved in the colonization of African people? Now, that's hard for black people because many of us are still Christian, right? But that's why I did the first chapter called The Reality of Racism. We have to accept reality.